Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 635. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone, and today is July 15th, 2024. A lot of news to talk about on today's show, but first I want to remind everybody that we are holding our summer fundraiser at the Libertarian Institute. We only look for money twice a year, and so whenever we hold one of these fundraisers, it's very important that our great contributors come out, make a donation so we could keep doing what we are doing at the Institute. We publish books, articles, and podcasts, and lots of everything. 14 books so far at the Institute, multiple podcasts, so there's a new episode out in the Libertarian Institute feed every day, and of course brand new op-eds and news articles at the Libertarian Institute every day. So you definitely want to head on over to the libertarianinstitute.org just to check on all the great content that we're putting out, and while you're there, go ahead and make a donation, help this show and everything else I do keep going. Also, you can follow me on Twitter at KyleAnzalone_ to keep up with all my work. All right, everybody, let's get into the show today. Like I said, we got quite a bit of news. Let's start off here with U.S. announces new weapons package for Ukraine after Biden-Zelensky meeting. So on Thursday, the U.S. announced a new weapons package for Ukraine after Biden met with Ukrainian President Zelensky during the NATO summit in Washington. The Pentagon said the new arms package was worth $225 million, but includes one Patriot missile battery, which typically costs around $1 billion, with all the related equipment. Antiwar.com asked the Defense Department about the discrepancy, but hasn't have a response at the time this article was published. So Dave says that in the package there is one Patriot battery, munitions for the National Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile System, Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, ammunition for HIMARS, 155mm and 105mm artillery rounds, TOW missiles, Javelin and AT-4 anti-armor systems, small arms ammunition, demolition munitions, spare parts, maintenance, and other ancillary equipment. The package is being provided in the form of the Presidential Drawdown Authority, which allows the Biden administration to send weapons directly from U.S. military stockpiles. The Pentagon also released a fact sheet that said the U.S. had provided Ukraine with more than $53.7 billion in military equipment alone since Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. The announcement of the weapons package and the new Patriot battery came after the U.S. and several NATO allies announced a plan to provide dozens of new air defense systems in the coming months. The alliance is also committed to giving Ukraine $43 billion in military aid in the year 2025. So, another story here dealing with the war in Ukraine. Ukraine's military intelligence says there have been attempts to assassinate Putin. So on Saturday, the head of Ukraine's military intelligence claimed there have been several attempts at assassinating Russian President Vladimir Putin. So this is from the head of Ukraine's main directorate of intelligence, known as the GRU. He said there have been attempts to assassinate Putin, but as you can see, they have been unsuccessful so far. He didn't offer any details about the alleged assassination attempts. He has previously made similar claims, and other officials in the GRU have threatened that Kiev was preparing to target the Russian leader. Last year, Ukrainian drones targeted the Kremlin, and the Russians treated the attempt as an attempted assassination on Putin's life. In response to the comments, the Kremlin said Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said the security of the president is established at the proper levels. Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova said the assassination attempt on Putin are funded with U.S. money. She said the U.S. would be better off spending the money on domestic security, pointing to the assassination attempt on former President Donald Trump. After the 2014 coup ousted Ukrainian President Yanukovych, the U.S. began helping fund the Ukrainian intelligence services that had been responsible for attacks inside Russia. The Washington Post reported last year that since 2015, the CIA spent tens of millions on the GRU and the Security Service of Ukraine, the SBU, to turn them into potent allies against Moscow. One former U.S. intelligence official described the GRU as our little baby and said the report said the SBU and GRU had been involved in dozens of assassinations against Russian officials in the Russian-controlled Ukraine, alleging Ukrainian collaborators, and against Ukrainian collaborators and Russian officials and civilians deep inside Russia, all while maintaining U.S. support. And one of the things that we frequently talked about this show on about the war in Ukraine and why it's so dangerous and why the point from my perspective isn't necessarily that Ukraine doesn't have a right to fight back or doesn't have a right to do these things to try to kill Putin and other Russian leaders, but rather the problem is they're doing it with American money, with American training, and only at the potential support of the U.S. And so we have to realize this would be the equivalent of something like Russia funding Mexicans or Canadians and them carrying out assassinations on American officials. This would obviously be highly provocative and highly problematic from the American perspective, just as this is from the Russian one, and it's easy to see why Russia views this as a direct war. Now, just a couple more things here. One, it seems really stupid to come out and say, I tried to kill someone and didn't do it in a case like this, right? Because it's going to, or it seems to me that it's going to provoke a response from Russia, and that response will likely come at Zelensky, would be my guess, that this kind of puts a pretty big target on Ukrainian President Zelensky's back. If Ukraine is taking shots at Putin, you could see, or you could imagine that Russian officials may feel it's a good idea to start taking shots at Zelensky. And so just want to throw that portion out there as well. All right, next up here, this one I wrote for the Libertarian Institute. Lithuania moves to exit cluster ban treaty, citing weapons effectiveness. So Lithuania is taking its first steps towards exiting an international pact that bans the use of cluster munitions on the battlefield. Due to the impact on civilians, cluster bombs have been widely outlawed. So the parliament in Vilnius has started the process of withdrawing from the Convention on Cluster Munitions, the CCM. According to a quote by the Deputy Defense Minister of Lithuania, who is also the legislation sponsor, he said, Russia's war against Ukraine shows it is extremely difficult to effectively substitute cluster munitions and their defensive power to stop large-scale attacks. By replacing standard munitions with cluster munitions, the amount of munitions needed to achieve the same effect is significantly reduced. So the CCM came into effect in 2010 and has over 112 nations as signatories. The treaty bans the use, transfer, production, and stockpiling of cluster munitions. Cluster bombs are anti-personnel weapons that have submunitions or bomblets that spread out over a wide area. After their initial use, many submunitions remain unexploded and often kill and maim civilians years or even decades after a conflict ends. As the war in Ukraine has turned into a war of attrition, cluster munitions have become more widely used on the battlefield. The White House began shipping cluster artillery shells to Kiev after depleting its stockpile of 155mm shells with conventional warheads. Ukrainian forces have found the cluster bombs are inadequate against armor and reinforced targets. While Washington, Kiev, and Moscow are not signatories to the CCM, the Joe Biden administration is violating American laws that prohibit the export of submunitions with high dud rates. However, in Congress, the decision to send the cluster bombs to Ukraine received bipartisan support. All right, so moving on to more news about the fallout from the NATO summit in Washington. While a lot of the attention is rightfully directed towards Ukraine, NATO is also preparing and building up for a war against China. And so let's talk about that next. This first one is from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. Hungary says it will support NATO will not support NATO becoming an anti-China bloc. So Hungary said on Thursday that it would not support NATO becoming an anti-China bloc, pushing back on the alliance's aim at Beijing during the summit in Washington. On Wednesday, the alliance issued a communique that slammed China for its trade relationship with Russia, and NATO has been working to build alliances in the Asia-Pacific in line with the U.S. military buildup against China. The Hungarian foreign minister was asked about these efforts and said, NATO is a defensive alliance. We cannot organize it into an anti-China bloc. NATO started targeting China in its documents in 2020, and in 2022 it formally declared the North Atlantic Military Alliance was facing a security challenge from Beijing. That communique read, the PRC, China continues to systematic challenge to Euro-Atlantic security. The communique reads, China has reacted by strongly warning the alliance to stay out of the Asia-Pacific. This week, the Chinese military is conducting drills with the Belarusian army inside Belarus near the Polish border, a move seen as a message to NATO. Hungary has been out of step with most of NATO regarding both Russia and China, as Budapest has been pushing for a ceasefire and peace deal in Ukraine and is looking to Beijing for help. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban made a surprise trip to China this week after visiting Ukraine and Russia. Hungarian officials called Orban's visit to the three nations a peace mission. In Ukraine, he suggested to Zelensky that he considered a ceasefire deal with Russia instead of demanding Russia withdraw before peace talks could start, but the Ukrainian leader rejected the idea. And so, Hungary has a very important role to play in NATO, in the Eurozone, just because of these unique positions. So that's a little bit of good news. The bad news is the communique really did strengthen the bloc's presence in the Asia Pacific. So I wrote this one for the Institute on July 11th. The North Atlantic Alliance agreed to step up its military presence in the Indo-Pacific to address a perceived threat from China. The bloc is using a gathering to mark its 75th anniversary to expand its presence in China's near abroad, a move sure to anger the People's Republic. So on Thursday, the leaders of the 32 NATO members signed onto a statement that blasted Beijing. It said, the People's Republic of China stated ambitions and coercive policies continue to challenge our security interests, security, and values. The deepening strategic partnership between Russia and China and their mutual reinforcing attempts to undercut and reshape the rules-based international order are causes for profound concern. The statement laid out a slate of complaints claiming that China provides Russia with crucial support for the war in Ukraine by exporting so-called dual-use materials. The communique adds, China has become a decisive enabler of Russia's war against Ukraine through its so-called no-limits partnership and large-scale support for Russia's defense industrial base. Officials from several NATO states have insisted on a more confrontational approach towards the PRC. Last week, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said, increasingly partners in Europe see challenges halfway around the world in Asia as being relevant to them, just as partners in Asia see challenges halfway around the world in Europe as being relevant to them. A Swedish official also recently suggested that a more bellicose stance towards China could help to pressure Donald Trump to become more supportive of the bloc should he win the upcoming election. For months, the bloc has sought methods to Trump-proof the massive military assistance to Ukraine in anticipation he will defeat Biden in November. The former president has vowed to immediately end the conflict if he returned to office, but has not explained how. On Tuesday, the White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan announced NATO and its Indo-Pacific partners, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, and Australia, will launch 4 new joint projects. Those initiatives will cover Ukraine, artificial intelligence, disinformation, and cybersecurity. The outgoing NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg and President Joe Biden met with the leaders of the 4 Indo-Pacific states during an alliance summit in Washington on Thursday. The bloc will address our shared security challenges, including Russia's war against Ukraine, China's support for Russia's war economy, and the growing alignment of authoritarian powers, Stoltenberg said, adding, in response, we must work ever more closely together to preserve peace and to protect the rules-based international order. Beijing reacted sharply to NATO's statement and has repeatedly slammed the bloc's increasingly hostile stance. So this is from a government spokesperson, Lin Yen, said at the daily press briefing. NATO is holding up China's responsibility on Ukraine's issue is unreasonable and has sinister motives. He argues that NATO's so-called security concerns allow it to trample on the legitimate interests of other nations. That's a very similar point to one we have been making on this show for some time. All right, next up here is this article. So, this is something I have mentioned a lot on the show, and it really doesn't get much attention in the media overall or much other commentary. But that is, anytime the U.S. does something in a military buildup directed at China, most, if not all that time, that's also going to impact the stance of North Korea. Now, maybe military bases in the Philippines and concern over the South China Sea aren't really the most provocative things for Pyongyang, but if you look at things like increasing military relationship with South Korea or putting more U.S. military assets in Taiwan, South Korea, or Japan, that's going to be a major provocation from the perspective of Kim Jong-un. So this article here from the Institute, July 14th, North Korea issues threat responding to NATO's Asia shift. So Pyongyang promised Washington and its allies they would pay an unimaginably harsh price for its increasing military presence in the Pacific. At last week's NATO summit, the bloc agreed to step up military activity near North Korea. Signed by NATO's 32 members, the statement called on the alliance to build ties with partners in the Pacific, namely Australia, Japan, New Zealand, and South Korea. The bloc went on to accuse the North of fueling Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine by providing direct military support to Russia. It says, we strongly condemn the DPRK's exports of artillery shells and ballistic missiles. It says, voicing great concern over the deepening ties between North Korea and Russia, adding any transfer of ballistic missiles and related technology by Iran or North Korea to Russia would represent a substantial escalation. Pyongyang reacted sharply to NATO's growing interest in the Pacific. A North Korean statement noted that the U.S. and South Korea signed an agreement on the use of nuclear weapons for the first time during the NATO summit in Washington. The deal is the first between the U.S. and South Korea governing the use of nuclear weapons. While the details of the agreement are not public, the two sides said it provides a solid foundation for enhancing U.S.-South Korean extended deterrence cooperation in an integrated manner. Pyongyang described the agreement as provocative. In a statement carried by North Korea state media, the defense ministry said, our enemy's nuclear threat, which is ever escalating in an offensive and frantic manner, urgently requires the DPRK to further improve its nuclear deterrent readiness. We know what we have to do, and we will continue our activities necessary for it. We seriously warn the hostile states not to commit such provocative acts, causing the instability anymore. If they ignore this warning, they will have to pay an unimaginably harsh price for it. And so again, this is predictable that North Korea is going to react this way. It's just, unfortunate that we are having this major escalation in the Asia Pacific. All right, one more story dealing with China here. New top U.S. envoy in Taiwan vows strong military support. So on Wednesday, the new U.S. head of its de facto embassy in Taiwan vowed to President William Lai that The U.S. would provide strong military support for the island amid rising tensions between Washington and Beijing. So the head of the office said, first of all, and the most important thing, the U.S. will strongly support Taiwan's self-defense capabilities. We have a common and long-term interest in peace and stability over the Taiwan Strait. According to the Taipei Times, the ambassador touted the 15 arms sales for Taiwan that had been approved under the Biden administration last month. The State Department approved a $360 million sale for hundreds of armed drones and military equipment. So the Biden administration has also taken the unprecedented step to provide military aid to Taiwan, which started in 2023. Since Washington severed diplomatic relations with Beijing in 1979, the U.S. has always sold weapons to Taiwan, but never financed the purchase or provided them free of charge. The administration has also taken steps to increase the diplomat support for Taiwan, which has also been reflected by increased congressional visits. These steps are being taken in the name of deterrence, but they have also increased tensions as China significantly stepped up military around Taiwan in response. When the new ambassador was the deputy chief of the mission in 2021, he explained how the U.S. began to view Taiwan differently during the Trump administration. He said when he first worked at the office 19 years prior, everything we did related back to cross-strait issues and now and how Taiwan can fit into the U.S.-China relationship. He said, by contrast, in the past 3 years, our efforts have been overwhelmingly focused on deepening bilateral U.S. and Taiwan relationship. This reflects a fundamental change in the U.S.-Taiwan relationship. The U.S. no longer sees Taiwan as a problem in our relations with China. We see it as an opportunity to advance our shared vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific. And this is just a, very concerning statement, right? Because it's obviously going to stoke and provoke a conflict. And so this isn't about peace or security or free and open Indo-Pacific. It's quite the opposite. It's like claiming in 2014 that extending NATO membership to Ukraine is about a free and open Eastern Europe. It's just absolutely absurd. All right, a couple stories here on Israel before we wrap up the show for today. Netanyahu reverses key Israeli concession made in ceasefire negotiations. So the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has reversed a key concession made by Israel during the ceasefire negotiations, CNN reported on Friday. The source said that Israel had previously agreed to allow Palestinians to have unrestricted access to North Gaza during any potential ceasefire. But last week, Netanyahu told his negotiators to add the condition that armed men aren't allowed to enter the north. Netanyahu included a similar condition in a list of non-negotiable demands he issued last Sunday. There will be no return of thousands of armed terrorists to the northern Gaza Strip, he said. The CNN report said Netanyahu's new demand could potentially upend negotiations. The Israeli leader has made other demands aimed at sabotaging the chances of a deal. In his latest list of demands on Sunday, Netanyahu said any deal must prevent the smuggling of weapons from Hamas from Egypt through the Gaza border. Axios reported that Egypt had agreed to build an underground wall to prevent armed smuggling through its border with Gaza, known as the Philadelphia Corridor, and the U.S. agreed to fund it. But after that breakthrough, Netanyahu demanded Israel maintain control over that corridor. He said, we will now allow the smuggling of weapons to Hamas from Egypt, first and foremost through Israeli control of the corridor and the Rafah crossing. Netanyahu also continues to insist that any deal must allow him to restart a genocidal war, a condition that supported by Mossad chief David Barnea, who has been leading the negotiations. Without the clauses Prime Minister Netanyahu insists on, we will not be able to renew the war, and without that, we will win or retrieve all the hostages. This is what is necessary for the benefit of the state of Israel, Barnea said at an Israeli security cabinet meeting on Thursday. And that's significant because he has been, acting as the chief negotiator for Israel with Hamas for some time now. All right, everybody, that'll do it for the show today. I don't really have many remarks on the attempted assassination of Donald Trump. I mean, obviously, anything like that is a huge problem. You don't want a massive outbreak of political violence in your own country, as we have seen in so many of the countries around the world that the U.S. has facilitated, fomented, or actively participated in, this kind of political violence where, assassination of leaders or regime change efforts. I mean, these things are extremely destructive to the fabric of societies and cause wider spread outbreaks of violence. So, obviously from that state, it's a bad thing. I know some people are pointing out, well, Donald Trump's a war criminal. And so, but there is a difference. I think it's somewhat similar to the charges against Trump, right? Where he was convicted in court, and sure, Donald Trump's a war criminal and should be convicted in court on Trump of charges dealing with, the wars he waged in Afghanistan, Yemen, Somalia, all of which were particularly cruel. I would support Trump going to jail on those issues. Now, these campaign finance charges for hush money payments to Stormy Daniels, I think maybe the political ramifications of that and how that impacts the political fabric of America is actually more of a negative than, the positive of actually punishing Donald Trump. And very much, the same thing with this assassination attempt. It's far more problematic. I will say, there's suddenly a lot of Democrats who are concerned about political violence who have been calling Donald Trump Hitler and an extremist for some time. Maybe this will be a wake-up call for Americans to tone down some of the more outlandish rhetoric. And I do notice this mostly coming from the Democrat side. Republicans are far-right MAGA extremists. Trump is Hitler. Trump supporters are Nazis. This kind of thing. Again, is probably why you ended up with that assassination attempt. All right, everybody, thanks so much for tuning into the show today. More later in the week, and if you haven't already, head on over to the Libertarian Institute and make a donation.